Hello, Martin Farr, co-chair of Insight's Public Lectures. 2018 was the 100th anniversary of Votes for Women, as we often refer to it in shorthand. The Representation of the People's Act only enfranchised some women. It was the 1928 Act which allowed women to vote on the same terms as men. And as I often point out, it was only in 1958, with the Life Peerages Act, that we have women in Parliament on the same terms as men, although even now not in the same numbers. But nevertheless, it was a major event coming after the war. There'd been many events which marked various centenaries in terms of the First World War. This act was passed toward the end of the war, and the December 1918 election was the first time that women could vote. And so we wanted to mark the event. We wanted to be part of the Vote 100 celebrations around the country, which involve people of all ages, all backgrounds, all parts of the country, as a major event in women's emancipation in Britain. And we wanted to have a lecturer who'd be very engaging and talk about this as a human experience rather than merely an academic historian. And so we found Jane Robinson, who had a book which was coming out, which was very widely and very well reviewed. And we knew we'd be able to communicate very well with an audience, which, as we'd hoped, was enormously varied in terms of age and background. We had lots of school children there, lots of university students, many of the female students having the Vote 100 women's colours. It was a really special evening, and we were delighted with the lecture and with the questions that followed, and we hope very much that you enjoyed this as the latest in our Insights Revisited series.
I'm Martin Farr, I'm Vice Chair of Public Lectures, and we were delighted to have this lecture this evening. We were very keen to have it. John Bercow's lecture was scheduled for May, no pun intended, because the female Prime Minister, the second female Prime Minister, decided to have an election, and so it was rescheduled. I think you'd rather she hadn't now, but it meant that we could open the programme with him and have to respond to changing circumstances, whereas this evening's event was always going to take place because we knew the centenary was coming along, and very exciting. I've been really pleasantly surprised by the extent to which this anniversary has really taken off in terms of press coverage, in terms of activities in schools and workplaces, in Parliament. Much more than I expected, a genuine explosion of interest across the generations. The challenge we have, of course, and something which has taken place long ago, is to try and find a new or fresh angle into it for the benefits of a public lecture. And I think we've done it today. I really think we've done it today with our speaker, who's been on Start the Week, and his book has been reviewed in the Spectator this week. Really an impactful publication, Hearts and Minds. And I should mention, rather to spare her the blushes, that there'll be a signing afterwards at a discounted £15 thanks to Blackwell's by Haymarket. That will be taking place afterwards. She also has a really well-written and well-populated writer's blog, so you can Google that. It's really lovely having an author engaging with their readership in this way. And this is marking, in Britain, the extension of the franchise to some women. One of the benefits, I think, from this event has been people realising it was only a staging post to full emancipation, as it were, as far as voting is concerned, which took place 10 years later. I saw a photograph this morning in one of the papers of women in Parliament Square in 1924 in freezing conditions, demonstrating for voting on equal terms as men. There were still 4 years to go of freezing conditions and protesting to get an equal suffrage. And I actually think that we don't really get democracy in this country until 1958, when women can be created peers, the Life Peerages Act 1958. So the stuff about 1,000 years of democracy is rather a selective viewing of history. It's a wonderful book, and I think it'll be a wonderful lecture. And so I ask you now to join me in welcoming our speaker this evening, Jane Robinson.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Martin. First thing to do is to check if you can hear me. Yes, excellent. I hope you can hear me. No? Yes. Is that better? There's somebody twiddling knobs. I hope they can hear me in the other lecture hall as well. People are very kind, and when they realise that you're a writer, they always ask what you're working on at the minute. And for the past couple of years, my answer has been the same. I'm doing a book about the fight for the vote, I say. ready for the big centenary in 2018, hoping that it would go by noticed. And I know what's going to happen as soon as the words have left my mouth. A succession of stock images will immediately spring to people's minds. And a group of determined-looking Edwardian women will stride towards us in a whirl of green and violet and white, usually wearing sashes, top-heavy hats, or the aprons and clogs of the factory floor. They carry placards. Who would be free must strike the blow, or maybe bricks and hammers. A few of them are being manhandled by policemen, while others raise their fists in strident protest. Or perhaps people picture a young prisoner with wild eyes and loose hair, strapped down in her cell and being forcibly fed. Or Emily Wilding Davison, lying on the Epsom turf with her broken head wrapped in newspaper. Ah, yes, everyone says, votes for women. It's all about the suffragettes. Well, as you may know, it's slightly more complicated than that. Like all women in history, campaigners for the vote have suffered from overgeneralisation, stereotyping. At the beginning of the 20th century, the press and cartoonists caricatured them all as lunatic harridans. This is just a sample of the sort of thing that I'm talking about. Two things about that. Firstly, being a suffragette didn't necessarily mean that you were an extremist. Victoria Lydiard was a proud follower of suffragette leader Emily Pankhurst and a member of the militant Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU. But she would never have dreamt of going on hunger strike because her mother said she mustn't. Her colleague Grace Rowe was appalled at the bra-burning antics of the so-called women's libbers in the 1960s. She considered first wave feminism, the fight for the vote, to be something of a spiritual campaign. And this didn't preclude violence, but it did lend it the gloss of evangelism. According to her, it was simply bad taste to show off. Second point, and the most important point, was that this movement was not all about the suffragettes. Of course, they played a vital part, and some lost their health, their families, even their lives, in defence of their beliefs. I've loved writing about them, especially the lesser-known names, but they were a minority, and it's important to remember that. They were the ones who caught the headlines, and for good or ill, their confrontational approach distracted public attention from the imaginative and quietly courageous work done by tens of thousands of others across Britain, dressed not in amethyst and emerald, but in their own uniform of berry red and leaf green, not singing Ethel Smythe's anthem about battle and strife, but songs like Harry's Jerusalem instead. They were the suffragists, the non-militant campaigners, who were just as determined about emancipation as their suffragette sisters. And these are the people that I'm focusing on this evening, the heroines and heroes of Hearts and Minds, and the founders of this country's tradition of massed peaceful protest. And I'll start, if I may, with an extract from the beginning of the book. Marjorie Lees was off duty. Some of the others had cut along an alleyway leading from the recreation ground to the marketplace to hold another open-air meeting. But Marjorie, Millie Field, Eda Sharples and Mary Siddall had done more than their bit yesterday and were stood down. It was a peaceful Monday evening in July 1913. The view of the Chiltern Hills was much gentler than the Lancashire fell Marjorie and her friends were used to. The air was soft, dusk was drawing in, and after 2 weeks on the road in their caravan, the women felt ready for a rest. They left Oxford at 9:30 that morning in a strange procession of around 70 women, many of whom were unfashionably tanned, some carrying slightly grubby banners, several on bicycles, and one even riding astride a horse, and shockingly dressed in khaki trousers. A few men marched with them, including an elderly fellow who'd walked all the way from Carlisle, and a handful of Oxford undergraduates so entranced by this curious company of women that they decided there and then to go with them to London. One of the lads was 6'7" tall, a useful attribute when scanning the crowds for trouble in the bad lands of the home counties. Everyone paused at Headington, the suburb of Oxford, for a group photograph to be taken with an elderly lady who, it was said, had signed that famous suffrage petition to Parliament way back in 1866. She was called Florence Davenport Hill. They arrived at the village of Wheatley, 5 miles down the road, at noon. The planned luncheon at the Merry Bells did not go entirely to plan. When their host saw how many of them there were, he blanched. He only had 7 cutlets available and a few hard-boiled eggs. It was a little like the parable of the loaves and the fishes, but without the happy ending. He refused to cook them anything else, and many went hungry, but they were used to that by now. At least here they weren't chased off the premises or pelted with rotten potatoes. Mrs. Vicar, at the next village, tried her best, but the open-air tea she had prepared didn't quite stretch far enough either. Still, she was apparently a doctor, as well as a clergy wife, and drove her own motor car. That was inspirational enough without tackling Mass catering too. Now they had arrived at Tame, Marjorie could feel herself relaxing. This was a lovely spot. She and her friends sat mending their increasingly tattered linen and giggled about a picnic near Banbury a couple of days ago when Mrs. Fletcher ate so much toasted cheese that her deck chair collapsed. Then someone dropped a plate of cakes on people's heads while trying to negotiate the steps of the Ark, which was their nickname for the caravan that had been their home since leaving Oldham. And Annie Davies sat on her hat after warning everybody else not to and flattened it. The weather was so fine in Tame that evening that the groom, Scholes, pitched a tent on the recreation ground for Millfield and Eda Sharples before leaving for a local inn with the horses. So they had no need to cram themselves into the Ark that night with Marjorie and Mary Sybil. It was 8 o'clock. They could hear the faint sounds of people singing, not very well, and high-voiced rhetoric floating across from the meeting in the town centre. All was well. There were 3 wooden caravans parked in Tame that night. 2 belonged to the Oldham contingent, the Ark, drawn by a horse called Noah, and the Sandwich, which was drawn by Ham. The 3rd one, the one at the back, was from Birkenhead, and it was pulled along by Polly. The Ark's comforts were limited. The bunks were surrounded by tins of food, boxes of pamphlets, change of clothes for everyone, spare hats, countless jars of marmalade, crockery, washing basins, books, and fold-up furniture. Given the space available, it was a relief that 2 of the women would be in a tent, sleeping outside. The women bade one another good night and were just beginning to get undressed when the tone of the music and speeches they'd been half aware of in the background began to change. They heard jeering and shouting, women screaming, someone blaring a hunting horn over and over. The noise grew louder. By now it was dark. 2 voices approached the tent. A couple of breathless policemen had hurried from the marketplace to warn the women that trouble was on its way. The meeting had broken up in chaos and a gang of hooligans was making for the recreation ground. Millie and Eda immediately crept out of the tent and into the Ark. Marjorie snuffed out the candles, barred the door of the caravan, and barricaded the windows with cushions. The clamour of the crowd, hooting and shouting obscenities, swelled terrifyingly as the 4 women pushed themselves as far to the back of the vehicle as they could and tried to sit perfectly still. It was difficult to know how many men were outside, certainly over 100. The noise went on for about 20 minutes and then began to die away. But the women were aware of different sounds now. The muttered oaths of men tripping over guy ropes and a weird, repeated rasping, which they realised with horror was the sound of matches being struck. The policemen had retreated, overwhelmed. The Oxford undergraduates were nowhere to be seen, and Scholes the groom was probably nursing a well-earned pint in the Spread Eagle. Once alight, the Ark would burn like tinder. How did these 4 respectable women find themselves in an Oxfordshire field in the last long summer before the Great War in fear of their lives? They were far from home at a time when few people strayed beyond their neighbourhoods, and women rarely, certainly ladies, rarely travelled without a gentleman to part the waves for them. Yet here they were at an unnamed town, cowering from a mob of ordinary British citizens threatening to kill them. Well, it was all for the sake of the vote. Marjorie and her companions were suffragists on a mission, taking part in one of the most successful and largest scale public demonstrations this country has ever seen. It was called the Great Pilgrimage of 1913. It was a 6-week massed protest march from all points around the UK, punctuated by hundreds of meetings like the one at Tame along the way, and culminating in a rally in London's Hyde Park of some 50,000 people. So why don't we know about it? This march changed lives. You should certainly know about it in Newcastle because it was one of the starting points of the Great Pilgrimage. And 100 years on from the first women being able to vote in parliamentary elections in this country, the spirit of this march is still changing lives. More about the pilgrimage in a minute. Meanwhile, I'll just briefly put Marjorie and her companions into context a bit. Historians like to date the orchestrated campaign for female enfranchisement back to 1792, when Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women was published. But women were involved in activism long before that. In 1427, a group of women in London complained to the House of Commons about a husband's inhumane treatment of his wife. The Levellers were early campaigners for universal suffrage for men, and some of their female members wanted to extend that concept by lobbying Parliament for a vote themselves. And in 1649, 10,000 of them signed a petition for the right to represent their grievances in government. It got nowhere, of course. 1832, Great Reform Act, wiping out so-called rotten boroughs by creating new constituencies to even out the number of electors around the country, and widening the franchise to include small landowners, tenant farmers, and shopkeepers. All householders who lived in boroughs and owned their own properties or paid an annual rent of £10 or more were eligible to vote, unless disqualified on other grounds, being lunatics, or criminals, or women. One of the first individual women's petitions to Parliament was presented in the wake of the Great Reform Act on the 3rd of August 1832. Hansard records its progress. The MP bringing it to the House of Commons, a Mr. Hunt, suggested to members that they might enjoy listening to this. He had been asked by a Mary Smith of Stanmore in Yorkshire, a lady of rank, he said, to explain why she did not have a share in the election of a representative since she paid taxes. And since she was liable to all the punishments of the law decided by a male judge and jury, why did she have no part in making that legislation? Someone in the House made the point that it would be rather awkward if juries were half male and half female. What would happen if they had to be locked up for the night together? This might lead to some embarrassment. Hunt replied, no doubt to guffaws from the floor, that he knew the honourable member was frequently in the company of ladies for whole nights, but wasn't aware of any ensuing mischief. The petition was then laid on the table. In other words, like all the others, it was thrown out. But now, once the precedent had been set of broadening the franchise just a little by the 1832 Act, a more concerted campaign for women's suffrage began to emerge with real hope of success. Not immediate success, perhaps, but a steady progression through the next few decades towards votes for women on the same terms as they were granted to men. Supporters were heartened by the news of the Declaration of Sentiments at the Seneca Falls Convention in New York State in 1848, when Americans Lucretia Mott, Martha Wright, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Mary Ann McClintock kick-started the feminist movement in the United States. Their statement, which was based on the Declaration of Independence, averred their rights as, and I quote, one half the people of this country, not to be oppressed by men, nor to remain entirely disenfranchised, but to be allowed to use their voices for the good of their country and of their souls. British suffragists agreed, of course, but the more they raised their voices, the louder brayed the opposition. According to anti-suffragists, women were not only intellectually incapable of meaningful political activity, they were physiologically and emotionally a mess. How can they be trusted to influence the government of the country when this is what their heads were full of? Just as the eminent Dr. Henry Maudsley claimed in 1874 that if women used their brains too much, their wombs would wither, so Sir Amroth Wright, who was another medic, wrote some 40 years later that, and I quote, "No doctor can ever lose sight of the fact that the mind of woman is always threatened with danger from the reverberations of her physiological emergencies. There is mixed up in the women's movement," he warned gravely, "much mental disorder." By woman's physiological emergencies, he meant, of course, her periods. According to Sir Amroth, peace would not ensue when a woman got the vote. On the contrary, it would only be achieved when she gave up, calmed down, accepted her natural disabilities, and stopped picking on men. In fact, when she ceased to resent the fact, and again I quote, that man cannot and does not wish to work side by side with her. In a diatribe that even at the time seemed quite extreme, Sir Amroth went on to state that only unfledged girls and the sexually embittered are likely to be moved by arguments in favour of women's suffrage. Women don't deserve the vote because they don't earn enough money. They only want the vote in the first place because they are naturally jealous of men. And then he pulled out his trump card. The civilised world was fashioned by men. Therefore, men should have sole dominion over it. It simply wouldn't be fair if women muscled in now the job was done. It's a mistake to think that everyone opposed to votes for women thought in the same terms. The popular argument, with which I'm sure you're familiar, was that women had their proper sphere, the home, and that their strengths were more spiritual than political. They could and should exercise influence solely through bringing up the family in piety and economy, and by supporting their menfolk in all things. After all, everyone knows that behind every successful man there stands or sits a woman, and it's better to possess a voter, so they say, than a vote. Be satisfied, dear ladies, with that. Before 1950, the scrolls on which petitions were presented to Parliament were routinely consigned to the furnace. A few have survived, but the most significant petition of all in the history of women's suffrage in this country is sadly not among them. It was drawn up in haste in 1866 and included 1,521 signatures, ranging from the female celebrities of the day, of whom there were very, very few. The scientist Mary Somerville is there, Harriet Martineau. And then it ranged from them to people like Ellen Nichols, who was a governess from Hampshire, the divinely named Bathsheba Pilby, who was a former grocer, and charwoman Emma Tingle. It's an incredibly democratic document. The petition was delivered to MP John Stuart Mill by two pioneers, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, the first woman to qualify as a doctor in England, and Emily Davies, who founded the first women's university college in the country. Here they are, in a slightly ridiculous painting, looking as though they just walked off the set of a low-budget costume drama. Out of the committee behind this 1866 petition grew a number of women's suffrage societies across the British Isles, which eventually amalgamated into the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, the NUWSS, in 1897. At its head was Dr. Garrett Anderson's sister, Mrs. Millicent Fawcett. Individuals of some charisma began to take up the cause. Jessie Cragen was one of the Scottish campaign's most spirited evangelists. I just heard today that she's going to be one of the names on the plinth of Mrs. Fawcett's statue in Parliament Square, which I'm delighted about. She was the daughter of a ship's captain and an Italian actress who had some experience of the theatre herself. This experience shone through when, from 1870 onwards, she started travelling around the UK holding meetings on such subjects as the rights and wrongs of women. She kept audiences enthralled with her booming voice and her huge stage presence. She must have covered thousands of miles with her dog Tiny, who was probably nothing of the sort, between Cornwall and Cape Wrath. She usually employed someone to march ahead of her, ringing a hand bell as she went, to grab people's attention, and then she would stride onto a makeshift platform, clamber perilously onto a chair, and begin the show. However they chose to go about persuading other people, most suffragists at this stage agreed on what was the point of women having a vote. It wasn't just a matter of natural justice. Women sought political influence to change things that had too long remained unchanged. Child poverty, sweated labour, the white slave trade, prostitution and trafficking, liquor laws, inadequate medical services, desperate working conditions, all these were scourges affecting women and children, and urgently in need of reform. And when Marjorie Lees from Oldham and her fellow pilgrims set out full of hope and excitement, somewhat in the spirit of Jessie Cragen, they were marching not just for the vote, but for a better world. Nothing much happened following the 1866 petition, apart from a certain amount of publicity, and a failed bill in Parliament drafted by a young high flyer called Richard Pankhurst. Attempting to navigate the legislation concerning women's suffrage is bewildering, believe me. Because of all the private members' bills and amendments and various clauses repealed and reinstated and successive readings, passed or fails, identifying the milestones along the hairpin bends on the way to the vote is not easy. Dr. Pankhurst's suffrage bill was lost on its second reading in the House of Commons in 1871. The subject was debated a total of 18 times between 1870 and 1904. On several occasions, further petitions were drawn up to back up the suffragists' argument. I mentioned the NUWSS a few minutes ago. It was a nationwide body which numbered some 600 branches, over 100,000 members at its height. At the time it was founded, everyone fighting for votes for women was called a suffragist. A Daily Mail journalist, writing on the 10th of January 1906, coined the term suffragette. It was meant to be disparaging, a diminutive suffix not only suggesting a frivolous, girlish attitude, but a sham. Just as leatherette was sham leather, cashmerette was apparently sham cashmere, suffragette was a sham campaigner. Members of the WSPU, founded by Dr. Pankhurst's widow Emily in 1903, chose not to take the hint. They embraced the term. Their slogan, "Deeds not words," signified a new age of proactivity in women's politics. The WSPU was designed to stir up and rejuvenate the suffrage campaign, and it developed into a far more substantial thing, an engine for change, fueled by the conviction of its officers and members. But a great deal has been said about the suffragettes, about how the militant campaign evolved during the next 10 years or so after they were founded in 1903, and how the authorities responded to it. So much so that, as I hinted at the beginning of this talk, many people think that the fight for the vote was their fight, and theirs alone. I do write about them in the book, about the WSPU, about hunger strikers and forcible feeding and so on, but my focus is the non-militant majority, the suffragists. And because suffragists have been comparatively ignored in the past, I have particular fun researching them. It's been so exciting and so revealing to find untouched diaries, unseen letters, keepsakes and souvenirs of a personal and political revolution. Even ordinary official documents have a certain charm. The archives and minute books of suffrage societies around the country, for example, which you might imagine are deadly dull because they're just all about meetings, but they're gold dust. They're so democratic at a time when women were simply not used to democracy. And they're full of fascinating, fleeting details like what colours look best in the light of oil lamps when you're speaking on a platform at an evening meeting. Never wear mauve. Or where to get the buns for the refreshments. It's the co-op, of course. It's in forgotten notebooks like these that one learns the tricks of the suffrage trade. If you're out campaigning, for example, and have any cardboard handy, you might think of slipping it under your bodice in case matters get out of hand and people start throwing things or manhandling you. Cardboard makes surprisingly sturdy body armour, especially if moulded to your body in the back first, and then allowed to dry. It was certainly better than the padding material the visiting American suffragist Alice Paul used to protect herself on a march in London. According to an onlooker, it was Lawrence Houseman actually who wrote about this, her buttons tensed over the padding like hounds on the leash, and I quote, when a few minutes later, under the excited gaze of an expectant crowd, the rough pounding began, the buttons, strained beyond endurance, broke from their moorings in swift succession, and the padding, like the entrails of some woolly monster, emerged, roll upon roll. She must have looked rather like the Michelin tire advertisement coming undone, for the material she had chosen for a chest protector was an unending coil of black cotton wool, wound round and round her body times without number. And when the outside coil slackened and gave down, the rest followed loop upon loop. The crowd was, of course, highly diverted. "Ooh, look, that one's got stuffing." And when you're talking about a grand historical episode like the fight for the vote, there is a danger of treating the people concerned like celebrities or ciphers. It's easy to forget that they were real people. I heard about Phyllis Keller, for example, in a letter she wrote from prison, treasured by her family ever since. She was a suffragette, not a suffragist, so she didn't join the pilgrimage, which I promise I will get onto in a minute. But I do want to mention her here, just so that you get an idea of the diversity of the people involved in this campaign and in the book. Phyllis Keller was arrested on the 5th of March 1912 for breaking the windows of arch anti-suffragist Lord Curzon. She was sent to Holloway, as so many of the suffragettes were. The letter she wrote home to dearest old mum a fortnight later is teeming with news. This is just one of several pages. First of all, she gets practical matters out of the way. She's sending all her dirty washing home and requests some clean handkerchiefs, a nightgown and her tidy blue coat and skirt in return. There's a new rule about food inside. As long as it's not sent by post, she's allowed any amount. She'd like Mum to arrange for 2 whole days' supplies a week, please. Make sure there's some liquid honey, a pot of marmalade, and a bottle of camp coffee essence. Potted meat is especially welcome, much better than the collapsible pieces of pie sent previously by Mum. She'll manage on the prison food for the rest of the time. When she's released in a week or so, can there be a taxi waiting to collect her? She can hardly be expected to walk across London with all her bags. The most exciting thing that's happened recently is that Mrs. Pankhurst has moved into the next cell but one to Phyllis. And next to Mrs. Pankhurst is Dr. Ethel Smythe. Mrs. P is far nicer than she looks. She's ripping, writes Phyllis. And Dr. Smythe plays the organ in chapel, making the services there slightly more bearable than usual. The main trouble is that there's no ventilation in prison. When everyone is packed into the same room as they are at prayers, it's impossible to breathe, and people are routinely carried out having fainted. Luckily, Dr. Garrett Anderson is also an inmate of the room. She's such a dear. Phyllis used to think she would never want a lady doctor, but if there are any more like Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, she says she can't think why you would ever want a male doctor to attend you again. I have to tell you at this point that Dr. Garrett Anderson's bedside manner was described elsewhere as brusque at best. She once emptied a vase of flowers over a recalcitrant patient's head. Phyllis tells Mum how she's spending her leisure time, of which there is admittedly a tad too much. They play rounders or hockey with a rolled-up sanitary towel for a ball. They're permitted to sit outside as long as they like, within reason, providing that they're doing prison work. Phyllis is sewing a shirt. And then there's housework. She polishes her boots with banana skins, which works a treat. And she's perfecting the art of having a bath in a pudding basin. A friend of hers has a big white Macintosh which she spreads on her cell floor. Then she pours her scant allowance of bathing water onto it, undresses, lies down, and squirms about. Phyllis has to content herself with trying to get clever with an ugly sponge. No doubt Phyllis's cheerfulness was assumed in part to comfort family and friends at home, and she does seem to have been a particularly resourceful suffragette, regaling her grandson in later life with tales of how she and her friends used to go to West End restaurants, have a meal, then climb up onto the tables shouting "Votes for women" and making a huge fuss and a racket, so much so that they were thrown out without having to pay a bill. But Phyllis was not alone in admitting that life in prison could have its compensations. She learned a great deal there. Phyllis wrote her letter home in 1912 after years of increasing militancy on the part of the WSPU and increasing politicking on the part of the NUWSS. The tide began to turn in the spring of 1913 when NUWSS committee member Mrs. Catherine Harley suggested that what was needed to break the deadlock threatening to scupper the whole suffrage campaign again and to rehabilitate its image was a grand gesture on an unprecedented scale. She had in mind a peaceful crusade, a march to end all marches involving thousands of suffragists across the British Isles, ending with a mass rally in Hyde Park. This is a poster for what was called the Watling Street route, which set off from Carlisle. Newcastle, of course, was at the head of the Great North Road route, but I haven't been able to find a poster for that. Surely such a spectacular event could not fail to capture the public's imagination and convince the government that votes for women were not only desirable, but inevitable. She gave the march the uplifting name of the Great Pilgrimage to suggest spirituality, unity, and a sense of mission. Saturday the 26th of July 1913 was chosen as the date for the rally which would mark the climax of the pilgrimage. Working backwards from then, timetables were calculated for the 6 principal routes, several of which have multiple starting points. They were named the Great North Road, the Watling Street route, the West Country route, the Portsmouth Road, the Brighton Road, and the Kentish Pilgrims Way. At a meeting of the hastily formed Pilgrimage Committee on the 8th of May, representatives from almost every federation came to London to advise the organisers on local conditions and contours, on suitable stopping places, possible overnight accommodation, including camping grounds, barns, the cheapest of cheap boarding houses. They were urged to ask their society members to consider feeding and putting up pilgrims, and of course to join the pilgrimage themselves for as long or short a time as they could manage. No pressure was to be put on anyone, but the expectation of practical help and financial as well as moral support was implicit. Costs were to be kept to a minimum. Anyone who could afford to pay their own expenses on the road was encouraged to do so. One of the aims of the pilgrimage was to raise money, as well as public awareness. So there was no policy of centrally subsidising working women or busy wives and mothers. If local societies did what they could in terms of providing accommodation and food, and federations fundraised for the rest, it was hoped that no one would be prevented from walking at least part of the way for lack of money. Lack of time was a different problem. As the date of the pilgrimage drew nearer, the stream of instructions from both national and local organisers swelled into a torrent. The detail included in them was remarkable. For all its spirituality, this pilgrimage was organised like a military campaign. Every pilgrim who signed up in advance was given a village-by-village itinerary, with all the information they could possibly need: where to stow your banners in Stockport, who would be their hostesses in Cambridge, where to buy paper drinking cups at a halfpenny each in Cheshire, who was eligible to ride in a motor car, and how to apply for permission to do so, and most importantly, where the ladies' lavatories were, which was very few and far between, you can imagine. No one was allowed to bring more than a single piece of luggage, in addition to their regulation NUWSS knapsack. Those on the shortest routes, starting from Brighton, were to set off on the 21st of July, but the longest routes from Carlisle and Newcastle would take a full 6 weeks. That meant leaving on the 18th of June. And about 70 pilgrims set off from Haymarket, just round the corner, 10:10 on the morning of Wednesday, the 18th of June. They were accompanied to Gateshead by a brass band, and then they set forth on the rest of the pilgrimage, joined by many more as they went. Aristocrats marched shoulder to shoulder with colliery girls, academics with housewives, the young with the old, and men with the vast majority of women. The great pilgrimage was about solidarity and mutual support. People joined in or dropped out along the way, each wearing the suffrage colours of red and green and white, and sparing as much time as possible for the ordinary round of daily life. Many stayed the whole course, travelling as far as 300 miles during 6 weeks from the middle of June to the end of July. Most walked. They were expected to cover up to 20 miles a day, and their feet swarmed with blisters. They got through successive pairs of boots, as you can imagine. The less able rode in horse-drawn caravans like Marjorie Lee's Ark, on horseback, the occasional motor car, and on bicycles. Everyone did what they could. I heard of one busy housewife and mother from Nottinghamshire who could afford neither the time nor the money to join the pilgrims herself, though she would dearly have liked to have done so. What she did instead was save up scraps of food for a week from the family's table, and she carefully wrapped them up, and she walked to meet the pilgrims at the closest point when they went by, and presented a precious packed lunch to say, this is just to keep you going along the way. and that was how she helped to win my vote. The purpose of the Great Pilgrimage was to demonstrate to Parliament and the people how many quiet, home-loving women, in quotes, of Great Britain wanted enfranchisement. They had been challenged to do precisely that. Asquith said, if you can prove how many ordinary women want the vote, then maybe I'll think again about giving it to you. National and local newspaper editors were alerted well in advance and asked not only to report on the passing of the Great Pilgrimage through their region, but to publish a letter explaining exactly what it was all about, clearly distinguishing between the law-abiding suffragists and the militant suffragettes. Some editors complied with the latter request, some didn't. Many of the audiences at the al fresco suffrage meetings that pilgrims held, as at Tame, didn't read the paper anyway, could hardly read at all. One of the pilgrims' attackers explained that, yes, he saw their banners, which proclaimed them to be non-militant, but he didn't know what non meant, so he attacked them anyway. Accidents and injuries were common, from traffic, grumpy horses fed up of towing caravans, stumbles into potholes or heavy mud. The pilgrims' most serious problem, however, stemmed from their supposed association with the militants. Anywhere they went, they were likely to be kicked and trampled by crowds who expected them to be arsonists and stone throwers. At many places, especially in the Midlands, they were terrifyingly assaulted. They received an unlovely artillery of mouldy vegetables, dead rats, elderly herring, rocks, cowpats, even bottles of sulphuretted hydrogen, which is a poisonous gas. Their clothes were torn from their bodies with leering insults. The filthiest obscenities flew through the air like bullets. When one of the, I forgot what the name it is, banners, one of the banners that they took with them was recently discovered in Keswick, and the archivist unfolded it after many, many decades. Pellets of lead shot fell out of it, no doubt throwing a shot at the pilgrims in fury. In an attempt to counter the violent welcome that they were getting at so many places, most of the pilgrims' banners were gracefully conciliatory whilst they were attempting to raise support, with elaborately embroidered slogans like, by faith, not force, and one of my favourites, weaving far and weaving free, England's web of destiny. And they emphasised the pilgrims' law-abiding approach. It didn't always work. I'm afraid you'll have to read the book to find out what happened to Marjorie Leeds when those matches were struck that summer night in Tame, and to share this awfully big adventure, as I have, with these pilgrims. I love that they came from so many different backgrounds, discovering strengths they never imagined they had, individually and collectively, and exploring the value, the heading power of solidarity. I hope you can tell how much I enjoyed researching this book and how much I enjoyed meeting the people I came across, metaphorically speaking, when I was writing it. A male student who joined the pilgrimage in Oxford was also delighted by the company. I have lunched with pilgrims, he said. I have tea'd with pilgrims. I have dined with pilgrims. And the whole time, I have heard more stories that I wouldn't tell my sister than ever before. I've decided the whole story of it is like some glorious sort of post-Edwardian road movie. It's exactly what it's like. They're 6 weeks on the road, all sorts of characters together, and then there's this great sort of climax in the big city at the end of it all. And all sorts of people were travelling together. Its protagonists belong to us all. They're not celebrities, they're not big names, they belong to us all. We've got Emily Murgatroyd, for example, who was a mill weaver from Burnley, she was the family's main breadwinner, but she thought the pilgrimage were huge sacrifices. She spent the whole 6 weeks on the road with no guarantee that she'd get her job back when she returned. And she had to save up enough money before she went to keep the family going while she was away. There was a young mother called Gladys Duffield, nicknamed Skinny Lizzie, who joined in the Lake District on impulse, leaving her young daughter with her mother-in-law and cheering everyone up when the going got tough. And her mother-in-law was delighted to look after the 5-year-old daughter. She said, I would go on the road if I possibly could, but my little bit towards the campaign for the vote is to look after my granddaughter. Alice New from Birkenhead, she rode a bicycle all the way with her student sister Hilda and was nearly killed by anti-suffragists in the Black Country. Lady Rochdale, who by the end of the march was so hot and smelly, her words, and looked so thoroughly disreputable that she was refused a room at a hotel. She was absolutely thrilled by this. There's young Jack from Devon there, who drove one of the caravans, and he ended up wanting to become a policeman so that he could protect the women who wanted the vote. And next to him is gloriously unfit Annie Ramsey, who'd only meant to wave her daughter off when the pilgrimage left Land's End, but somehow ended up walking the whole way and being called their honorary mother by all the other pilgrims, and so on. These are our homely, passionate great-grandmothers, our eccentric great-aunts. Ladies, lads and dads and workers and women, all marching together, everyday people doing a really extraordinary thing. When asked by someone what bound them together, one of the pilgrims gave an inspired answer. We're just representatives, she said, of every woman on a long walk. And I quote, we're homemakers, wives and mothers, who feel so intensely the disabilities under which they suffer from man-made laws, and yet are unable to come out and fight for their own enfranchisement. We are just the comparative few who have the nerve and strength to leave their homes and endure a few weeks of hardship in order to help their less fortunate sisters, women old and young, drawn from all ranks of life, and yet bound together by a common tie of sisterhood, powerful enough to break down all differences in age and social standing, mothers and daughters as true comrades, peeresses and mill hands as real friends, all stepping out together to convert England. And that's what they did. The Great War intervened, but I have no doubt that the success of the Great Pilgrimage did more to win women the vote than any other single element of the suffrage campaign. After witnessing it, even Prime Minister Herbert Asquith, no champion of women's suffrage, was forced to confess that he was struck by the suffragists' dignity, stamina, and powers of persuasion, at a time when the unpopular militant suffragette campaign was at its height. When asked afterwards by one of the pilgrims whether he would now admit that women had finally won the right to be called people in a legal sense, and therefore to vote under the terms of a representation of the People Act, he said to have replied, albeit rather doubtfully, that yes, he supposed women were people after all. The NUWSS leader, Mrs. Fawcett, a part-time pilgrim herself, she was beside herself with joy when the Representation of the People Act received royal assent on the 6th of February 1918. We've won, she sobbed, laughing. We've won. So what was their legacy, these steadfast mothers of our democracy? It's said that Mahatma Gandhi was inspired by Mrs. Fawcett and her campaign when he first embraced passive resistance in 1907, going on himself, of course, to inspire millions and millions of others. Suffragist processions became the pattern for countless peaceful demonstrations on the streets of our towns and cities in this country and abroad. The pilgrimage foreshadowed a much more famous occasion, perhaps unjustly so, when 200 men marched from Jarrow to London in 1936. The women of Greenham Common enjoyed the same sort of dedicated sisterhood as the pilgrims did, any one of whom might stand as a role model today. The Great Pilgrimage is at the root of our flourishing tradition of peaceful mass protest and at its heart. The Great Pilgrimage was the suffragists' answer to both the fanaticism of the militants and their own perceived lack of heroism. A statement of belief in the power of ordinary women and their ability when working together to turn the world upside down, without violence or hatred. It was dangerous, it was difficult, physically and emotionally challenging. It broke every rule in the book about how Edwardian women of every class were supposed to behave. But it was glorious too. It was a peaceful fight against low expectation, low self-esteem, constant stereotyping, and the spurious comfort of the status quo. And perhaps unlike the suffragettes, the suffragists had faith that victory was assured as long as they walked calmly and purposefully to claim it, rather than charging at it in fury. And that's why the pilgrimage is so beguiling for me, because step by step they are marching towards emancipation. They were optimists, goodness knows how, after 50 years of campaigning. for almost nothing. And they were confident that the strength of spirit embodied by the Pilgrims and their supporters would prove irresistible to the government, that this time their voices would not only be heard, but understood. Well, we can't give them and their militant sisters much in return for their efforts, except a promise to use the vote they fought so hard to win, and wherever it's necessary, to keep on fighting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane. You make a really compelling case for the pilgrimage and its importance. Why has it been so underappreciated, do you think, hitherto?
I think one of the reasons it's been so underappreciated is because the suffragettes were so good at their job. The job of the suffragettes was to court public attention, to make sensation and to shock. And that shock has been enduring. And every movement needs people to put their heads above the parapet and to attract the attention. But then you need this groundswell of solidarity underneath to actually explain what it's all about. And people then and now have got carried away by the heads on the parapet and forgotten about what was going on.
We have some roving microphones, and we have time for questions and conversations and comment. The first question here, in the middle of the row, and on this side, I have the first question. Yes, second right here.
I remember I have heard the argument in the US that women were given the vote there because they did some sort of survey and found out that women actually voted more conservatively than men.
I haven't heard that one. Of course, in the United States, the vote sort of crept up on the country because it was done state by state. And Wyoming was the first, long before we got the vote. And I think the last state was in 1920, so it was done on a state-by-state basis. There were certainly arguments in Parliament here that maybe women would vote, maybe they would all vote Tory, maybe they would all be Liberals, maybe they would be Labour. There seemed to be no rhyme or reason about it. Maybe that's part of the reason that women had to wait so long for the vote, was because men thought, because of our physiological emergencies and things like that, that we would just sway with the wind and be terribly volatile and ricochet around the ballot box, not knowing what to do. I don't know.
Question over here, John.
Given sort of virulence of the opposition that you described there, right up to 1913, do you think that these peaceful protests, including the pilgrimage, led to sort of a sea change in opinion towards women and equal rights, or had they just sort of shifted the opinions of a small number of men within Parliament in order to get the Act passed in 1980?
No, I think the pilgrimage in particular led to a sea change of opinion. Because if you think about it, I don't know if you remember the map, but there was a map showing this web of routes. And every morning and every evening there would be a meeting held, and a resolution passed, and a petition signed. And so this is working through all the areas of Great Britain, explaining what the vote was all about. And it was the first time that anybody had taken the trouble to explain to so-called ordinary people what this would mean. So it was a very deep-rooted, educative process, I think. It wasn't whimsical, and it wasn't just aimed at Parliament. It was a grassroots movement.
In the centre.
Hello. In your research, did you come across much information about women from the northeast who took part?
Yes. I mean, there's a great source, which is the magazine for the NUWSS, which is the Common Cause. It's called the Common Cause. And it reported on special trains being laid on so that women could get to Newcastle. And also a great contingent from Scotland came down to Newcastle. And I should say that the whole pilgrimage was inspired by a march the winter before of a handful of women who went from Edinburgh through Newcastle down to London. They were called the Brown Women. And so, yes, to a certain extent. But because the pilgrimage was organised so quickly, only 2 weeks, 2 months, there wasn't a huge amount of time for people to sort of talk about and write about how it's going to be organised. But most record offices in the country, and often museums as well, are likely to have records of suffrage societies. So if you're from an area that you want to find out more about, go to your local record office, and I bet you they'll have something on the local suffrage society. Because there were 100,000 members, there were 900 branches, and a lot of them were very careful about keeping their records.
Yes, I'll just mention that Newcastle University has in its special collection some material from Dr. Ethel Williams, who was a great
wonderful.
NUWSS
Well, she
member,
spoke to the pilgrims at Haymarket before they set off.
including a banner. So there's a Newcastle banner in the library.
Fantastic. Well, yes, Dr. Williams was the one who sort of G'd them all up right at the beginning of the pilgrimage to set off. Oh, how I would love to have been there.
I have to mention the women from Edinburgh, because I actually thought that the march actually started from Edinburgh all the way through Newcastle down to London. But
Not
they're
this
saying
time.
that it was a different march.
That's a different march, which to the winter of 1912, can you imagine? They walked all the way from Edinburgh to London through the winter. And they carried little green lanterns as they went along as the afternoons closed in. They're so brave. They really were. But no, the great pilgrimage was Newcastle and Carlisle and Hull.
Any other question?
Did any of the women you studied, or are you aware of any other female parliamentarians who were concerned about women's rights in the Empire?
There were quite a lot of suffrage speakers who came and visited. So we got Alice Paul, the one who was lost to a stocking. She played a great part in the suffrage movement here. Also, Muriel Matters from Australia came over because, of course, most of Australia got the vote before we did, and Alice Paul already had the vote. I was talking about this sense of sisterhood actually on the pilgrimage, but there was a global sense of sisterhood as well, and wherever the spotlight shone, as you know, wanting to get the vote next, people sort of clamoured to help, which I find quite moving actually. If they could, obviously these were usually moneyed women who could do this, but there was a great sense of mutual support.
And question over here as well.
For this talk, I would like to ask about the people who were throwing the rotten tomatoes and the rotten potatoes. Who were they? Presumably men, but perhaps not. And the other thing is, did that reflect a continuing kind of misogyny in society which still exists today?
It's difficult to tell. Number one, who were they? There were women amongst there as well who were frightened. And it's difficult for me to convey to you how terrified people were of the suffragettes. They were really scared. These were women who were throwing bombs and setting fire to things. This was like a vision of hell or something. This was the world turned upside down. And even though it was mostly happening in London and in Manchester, when a group of campaigners was coming to your village and all you had heard about was these terrorists, you were going to be scared. And the women were scared as well as the men. And that's why I find the pilgrims, another reason why I find them so moving, is that if they were attacked, like the pilgrims were at Tain, the next morning they came back to the marketplace when things had cooled and quieted down a bit, and held another meeting saying, look, here we are again, you know, we're not terrorists, we're not terrorists. So that's how they managed to get the message across. But something else that's very significant about that is that for many of the places along several of the routes, the anti-suffragists tried to get there a day or two before and hold a meeting saying the terrorists are coming, so be prepared. So it wasn't necessarily a sort of societal misogyny. It was a very localised feeling.
Right over here on the left. Question.
I've been in education for 15 years now. I've been focusing on history for the past 5. And I've never once been taught about the suffragists' dress anything like that. Do you think that's like a huge undeveloped part of like the British education system? A lot of the history focuses on the men.
Well, I'm 11th book. This one is my 10th, and they're all social history through women's eyes. So tell me about it. But it's a shame that I mean, most of the suffragists were women, so and so were the suffragettes. So why don't we know about the suffragists? I think that's something to do with a sort of culture of caricature and sensationalism and just not listening to ordinary voices. And that's what this whole struggle was about. It was about voices. And heavens alive, we owe them that. We should listen to what they say.
There's one that I've lost. Could you re-wave, please? There we are. Thank you much. Just wonderful. Thank you. Yes.
What about the chain makers? What were the relationships between suffragettes, suffragists, and women in trade unions?
Pretty close, actually, and maybe I'm not as well qualified to talk on this as on other things, but there were certainly many suffragists who were trade unionists, and many people on pilgrimage who were trade unionists. So yes, there does seem to have been a close relationship. I think it all falls down to natural justice in the end, and campaigners in some arms of that campaign, crossed over into others.
A question?
What did the suffragists do when they got to London and subsequently, sort of after this amazing pilgrimage?
When they got to London, they had a huge rally in Hyde Park, which was 50,000 people. They had a massive party on the Saturday night in London. Next morning, they staggered rather blearily to a special service that was put on at St Paul's for them. And apparently the sermon was absolutely dismal. But there was another service in what was called the Ethical Hall, which was addressed by suffragist Maud Royden, who is one of my heroines. And she made an absolutely inspiring speech and said, we are all pilgrims now, and we must go out and do our stuff. It's in the book, actually. It's worth reading. It's a fantastic speech. So. And then they went back to their constituencies to prepare for government. But of course the war came, and during the war, a lot of them worked in what was called the Scottish Women's Hospitals Union, which was not exclusively Scottish women, it was just set up in Scotland. And this was hospitals in the field that were staffed entirely by women. So women surgeons, right down to women orderlies. And a lot of them were members of the NUWSS and were sponsored by members of the NUWSS at home. And then when the war was over, got the vote. But only if you were over 30, only, with certain qualifications. So Marjorie Lees, my lovely Marjorie Lees in her caravan, who worked campaigning for suffrage for years and years and years, even before the pilgrimage, she was over 30, but she lived with her mother, so she didn't earn property, and she didn't have a degree because she hadn't been to university. So she couldn't vote. So 1928.
And question over on the right.
Thank you, Bruce, I'm actually quite new to it.
I can't see you. Can you wait? Oh, there you are. Yeah.
I was wondering how you first heard about these women, and if you decided to write a book specifically on them, or discover about them after you wanted to write about the movement.
Well, I mentioned that this was my 10th book, and unlike some of the media, it seems to me, who have been pelting me with things in the last few days saying, you may not know, but it's the centenary of women's suffrage. I have actually seen it coming for a while, so I knew that I wanted to write something about that. I had to, I'm a women's historian, as you know. But I couldn't think what angle to take, and I'm always drawn to the ordinary voices in history rather than the well-known, oft-heard ones. And I simply went to a library just to root around to see if it would give me an angle, and came upon mention of Great Pilgrimage. And the more I heard about that, the more staggered I was that A, I hadn't heard anything about it, and B, nobody wrote about it. And once I found the pilgrimage, I managed to track down 7 or 8 diaries which were written by people on the pilgrimage, including one that's in North Carolina. I had to go to University of North Carolina for that. And it's just a perfect subject and just a wonderful story. And I can tell it from almost literally from the horse's mouth, actually, from Noah and Ham. So, yeah, it's what's not to like. It's just great.
We're going to go on the left front.
Could I ask a question about the seeming contradiction of a statue of Emmeline Pankhurst outside Parliament and a plaque to Christabel and the awarding of damehoods, and we're only just getting round to recognising Millicent Fawcett's leadership of what I agree with you was a much more significant long-term movement? Why did that not happen earlier, especially since many people viewed suffragettes as terrorists?
Yeah, well, I think it's because in history extremes are always more, always get more attention than moderation. And the Mrs. Fawcett and her lot were essentially moderates. They were conciliatory. They were constitutionalists, and that's not very sexy, is it? And I think we've matured as a society so that we can recognise the part that she played. But I agree with you. I think it's very hard when you write about people not to feel as though you've got to be their champion, and they don't need me as their champion. But I do feel sort of vicariously hard done by that she has been so staunchly ignored in the past, and I'm delighted that she's getting a statue, although I'm slightly ambivalent about this whole statue thing, because I would rather something live were made out of remembering them rather than, you know, most statues are of men who've done military things and they just stand there going like that. I'd love something living somehow to be made of commemoration. But anyway, there we go.
If it's any consolation, Radio 4 did a poll of influential women.
Yes.
And Millicent Fawcett
I
won.
know. Yes.
So there you go.
Could it be because I voted about 8,000 times?
Hi. There was an interview on Tuesday with Amber Rudd and giving an official pardon to those who undertook militant action was discussed. And I'd just be really interested to hear if you had an opinion on that, and if so, what your opinion was. Kind of, is it a really slippery slope to go down? That was discussed. So yeah, it's just interesting.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Almost every account you read by a suffragette who's gone to prison, the one thing they have in common is that they are desperate that they will not be bailed out. And actually marriages were broken when husbands marched along to the court and tried to bail out their wives. And I think the suffragettes would be horrified at the thought of getting something as bland as an official pardon. I don't think they would be happy with that at all.
Right at the back, very far.
Cool. Just a couple of questions. So one of them, do you think the war's sped up the process for getting on the board? Do you think it impeded it? And do you think the sort of protest can still be viable today? What do you think we can learn from it? People in, 100 years later in conflict world?
Yeah, good question. Did you all hear the question? Asking, first one. About the war, yes. Did the war speed up the process of women getting the vote? And also, what can we learn from this 100 years later? If anybody tells you, and I'm afraid they quite often do, that women only got the vote as a reward for what they did during the war, they are not right. And I hope you now have a sense of how this was one very long narrative, and the war was one chapter in that narrative. And women did amazing things during the war, the Scottish Women's Hospital that I was talking about being one of those things. But they were fitted to do those things because they were seasoned by campaigning. And it's a continuous story. And of course it helped tremendously. But I mean, the only reason that the government had to do a new representation of people act was because so many soldiers were fighting abroad, of course, and so they didn't satisfy the residency clauses. So they had to change the law in order to let soldiers vote, otherwise they wouldn't have been eligible. that's one of the main reasons why the law was changed, and with women sort of slipped in the slipstream. So yeah, it did have an effect, but not as decisive an effect as many people think. The second thing, I think, it is answered by my side of the Women's March that I was so proud to take part in last January in London. There's still something very heady, very moving, and very powerful about people just coming together and putting one foot in front of the other, together with a shared purpose. And I think that is a legacy of the pilgrimage. And I'm not saying it all started with the pilgrimage. I mean, up in this part of the country, you've got the galas and things. I mean, you've got people marching. It's a heritage, but it's a really potent heritage. And I think we're still enjoying it now.
I had some reserved questions just in case, and they weren't needed. They were in fact asked, which is wonderful, and everyone stayed, and it's been tremendous. And I hope you'll agree with me that our wishes for a stimulating and fresh perspective were fulfilled this evening. Would you join me in thanking our Speaker General?